Okay, in this video, we're continuing our discussion of AUC Section 265 as it relates to communicating deficiencies in internal control to management that was charged with governance. But up until this point, we have identified deficiencies in internal control and then evaluated those deficiencies. And now we're going to go through how exactly do we communicate those deficiencies. So first, we see here that we should communicate in writing to those charged with governance on a timely basis the significant deficiencies and also the material weaknesses that we identified during the audit, including those that were remediated during the audit. So if the client fixed the deficiency while we were performing the audit, we still need to communicate those to those charged with governance. And then next we see here, we also need to communicate those deficiencies to management at an appropriate level of responsibility. And so we have here in this first paragraph where we communicate significant deficiencies and material weaknesses in writing. And that would be the ones that we're communicating to those charged with governance. We also need to notify management that we're notifying those charged with governance about these significant deficiencies and material weaknesses. And we do that in writing. But we, of course, wouldn't do that if it would be inappropriate to communicate directly to management about those deficiencies. Like, for instance, if maybe the person in management that we're communicating with is the one that's causing these material weaknesses in some way. So we might not communicate directly with them if it doesn't seem appropriate. The second paragraph here is that if we have deficiencies in internal control that aren't necessarily significant deficiencies or material weaknesses, but that we think are important for management to know about so that they can maybe correct them going forward, then we would want to communicate them. And we can either do it in writing or orally. And this is only deficiencies in internal control that aren't significant deficiencies or material weaknesses. So it's just something that things that they should be aware of. And if we decide to just tell them orally, then we should document in our work papers the communication that we had. And next we see here that we should make these communications within 60 days following the report release date. And this is the same amount of time that we have to close down and archive the audit binder. So that can be part of our wrap up and closing down procedures. And so now we get into what exactly should we include in our written communication of significant deficiencies and material weaknesses that we have here. And it says that first we should include a definition of the term material weakness, and when relevant, the definition of the term significant deficiency. So if there are significant deficiencies, we might want to make sure that we include that definition in the letter. And these definitions are up in the glossary of this section that we saw in an earlier video. Also, we want to include a description of the significant deficiencies and material weaknesses and explanation of their potential effects. We want to include sufficient information to enable those charged with governance and management to understand the context of the communication. So in particular, we should include the following elements that explain the purpose of the audit, and that was for us to express an opinion on the financial statements. It should also include an explanation that the audit included a consideration of internal control over financial reporting to design our audit procedures, but it wasn't necessarily designed for us to give an opinion on the effectiveness on the internal control. I want to make sure that they understand that, hey, we just came across these deficiencies while we were planning the audit and doing our walkthroughs of their processes and such, but we didn't necessarily test their internal controls, so we don't know for sure if their controls are effective or not. It's just as we were going through the audit, we noticed these things that might be helpful for you to know about your processes. And in connection with that, we want to make sure they understand that we're not expressing an opinion on the effectiveness of their internal control, and that our consideration of internal control is not designed to identify all the deficiencies in internal control. There might be material weaknesses or significant deficiencies, and therefore there might be others that exist. So whenever we're preparing this report, there's typically a template that includes all of these statements for us, and we put in the descriptions of the deficiencies that we have here. Next, if we issue a written communication that says there's no material weaknesses identified during our audit, then we should include the matters in paragraphs 14A and C through D. So it would be the definition of these and C and D. So even though there's no material weaknesses or significant deficiencies, we would still want to include all of these disclaimers to help them understand the level of procedures that we did related to their internal controls. And of course, if there were no material weaknesses or significant deficiencies, we wouldn't include a description of them. And B was what was excluded. And finally, we should not issue a written communication stating that no significant deficiencies were identified during the audit. And we'll see why here in a little while. But we've got a lot of explanatory material to go through here, starting with A15 all the way through about A36, it seems. So let's go down to those sections. Okay, so now we're down in the explanatory material as it relates to communicating the deficiencies in internal control. So it reiterates here that Section 260 establishes the considerations for communicating significant deficiencies and material weaknesses to those charged with governance. AUC Section 265 that we're in now is more specific to communicating with management. So next they note here that even though we're required to make the communications to management within 60 days following the report release date, they reiterate that it's best for us to communicate these matters as soon as possible after the report release date, because certainly it might be helpful for those charged with governance and management to understand those deficiencies and implement corrections to them. And they also suggest here that even if we decide or we take a long time to communicate the matters to management, those sorts of governance. So if we take a long time to do that, we could, in the meantime, tell them those matters orally so that they're able to take timely remedial action if they need to, while we're actually drafting up a formal written document about those. However, they note that our oral communication doesn't relieve us of our responsibility to communicate them in writing. Even if we tell management those sorts of governance the deficiencies, we still need to write it up and give them a letter. And so another matter of professional judgment of ours is how detailed do we want to get in the communication of significant deficiencies and material weaknesses. Do we want to go into deep detailed analysis about them, or should we just kind of stay high level? And that goes in different circumstances. We might decide different courses of action, but they provide here some suggestions of what we could consider when we're deciding the appropriate level of detail. We might consider the nature of the entity, we might consider the size and complexity of the entity, the nature of the deficiencies, the entity's governance composition, and legal or regulatory requirements. And so all these would suggest that we should be more detailed if the people that we're communicating with either aren't familiar with the industry or they are farther removed from management and unaware of the day-to-day operations of the companies and that sort of thing. So however we think is best for us to get across to management and those sorts of governance the importance of these deficiencies. And so next we have an important one here. When we're deciding on the deficiencies that we want to communicate with management, we need to exclude from our considerations the cost and benefit analysis. For instance, if we think that a deficiency might cause the financial statements to be misstated, then we should include that as a deficiency. And even though management or those sorts of governance have decided not to implement or to remedy that deficiency due to cost, so that part is irrelevant to us. And also, we may find that some of the deficiencies that we communicated in prior years are still remain, and the management has not remedied those. And so that doesn't prevent us from continuing to include those deficiencies in our communications going forward, as long as they're there and they're important. And that in itself might be a deficiency, is their failure to remedy prior deficiencies that we found. So those are some considerations that we might make. So now we have some more details on communicating the deficiencies to management. So as we saw before, we're required to communicate to the appropriate level of management. In most cases, that's going to be the CEO or the CFO, but it could also be at the level of operational management. So whoever has the authority to take remedial action to correct those deficiencies, that's who we should communicate them to. So next we have some examples of deficiencies that we might not communicate directly to management, and that might be if we've found that management lacks integrity or competence, or they're committing fraud or intentionally not complying with laws and regulations, or if they don't really have the ability to oversee the preparation of the financial statements. And so those might be situations where we would find it not appropriate to communicate directly to management. And they remind us that there are requirements for us to communicate on compliance or fraud, and those are in sections 250 and AUC section 240 respectively. And we went through those sections in prior videos. And next, they provided some more information on communicating other deficiencies in internal control. And remember, these are ones that are not necessarily significant deficiencies or material weaknesses, but that we think are important that management know about them. And that's, of course, a matter of professional judgment. And so those particular deficiencies don't necessarily have to be in writing. We can tell them orally. And for those in particular, if we've communicated them in the past and management decided not to remedy them for various reasons, then we don't need to repeat the communication in the current period, because we told them last period and they know, and they're not really important enough for us to keep bothering them about. We also don't need to communicate items that have been communicated by other parties, for instance, internal audit or regulators, so we don't need to regurgitate those the deficiencies. However, it might be necessary for us to re-communicate them if there was a change of management or if there's new information that has come to light during this year's audit. And of course, as we discussed before, management's failure to remedy any deficiencies could be a significant deficiency that we might need to communicate. So we need to keep that in mind, and of course that comes with our significant judgment as well. And of course, we're not precluded from communicating to those sorts of governance the other deficiencies that we communicated to management. So we can certainly communicate those sorts of governance orally or in writing, however we think is appropriate. And so next, as you remember, we are required to not only disclose the details of the deficiency, but also the potential effects of the deficiencies and material weaknesses. But they want to reiterate here that we don't necessarily need to quantify those effects. We just need to describe them in terms of control objectives and types of errors the control was designed to prevent or detect, and the risk of misstatement that the control was designed to address. So we wouldn't necessarily say that X amount of money is at stake of being misstated, but rather we would say the things that are likely to happen since that control is not in place. Some of the things we might also include in the written communication is we could group the deficiencies as we see appropriate, rather than having a whole lot of individual deficiencies. We could group them together in common categories. So as an example, maybe we, instead of saying the company did not reconcile the cash, reconcile the accounts receivable, reconcile the inventory, reconcile the property, plant, and equipment accounts, we might just include them all into one deficiency and say the company did not reconcile its balance sheet accounts, major balance sheet accounts. We might also suggest remedial action on the deficiency, so the things that they could do to correct the deficiency. We could include management's responses, what their thoughts were on the deficiency, whether they agreed or not, and why or why not. And we could also make a statement about whether we've undertaken any steps to verify whether management's responses have been implemented. So there's a lot of different things we could include in our written communications there, but we don't necessarily have to include these. And of course, we have the professional judgment to communicate these in the way that we think is best. And finally, we remember that we're not supposed to include a statement that there are no significant deficiencies. We can, however, provide a communication that says there were no material weaknesses that we found. And of course, this doesn't provide any assurance about the effectiveness of their internal control, so we need to include the statements above that described the nature of the work that we did, and that we did not test the effectiveness of the internal controls. And so we've got Exhibit B here that is an illustrative example of communication saying that there were no material weaknesses in our audit. So let's go down to Exhibit B. Well, first let's take a look at Exhibit A, which is a template of our written communication. So first we see it's directed to those charged with governance. So we tell them that our procedures around internal control were merely so that we could design audit procedures, and not for us to make an opinion on the effectiveness of the company's internal control. So that covers one of the steps that we, one of the requirements that we had. It also says that the process that we went through and the procedures that we did might not identify all the deficiencies in internal control that might exist. So there might be some other ones that we're not telling them about here. But in spite of that, we found some items that might be material weaknesses or significant deficiencies, and we would identify them down here. But first, we provide the definition of significant deficiency and material weaknesses as we're required, that we saw in the section above. And we tell them about the deficiencies here. And then we restrict the use of this report to those charged with governance. And then we sign city and date, or city and state and date. And then we have Exhibit B here that's an illustration with no material weaknesses. That Exhibit A had some material weaknesses and significant deficiencies, but this one has no material weaknesses. And so it says here, the rest of it's the same, but we say that during our audit, we did not identify any deficiencies that would be material weaknesses. And if we had some significant deficiencies, we might include them here. Otherwise, that would be blank. And then it would restrict the report, just like the Exhibit A, and sign city and state and date.